Hello everyone, just a heads up, this episode is cursed. We recorded it the first time and Kayla's mic had a catastrophic glitch. Here's a sample.
1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, looks like it's recording on my end. Are we recording on your end?
We got together and recorded this entire episode a second time. That time, my mic must have had a bad setting turned on because my audio is a bit echoey. I've done what I can, but I'm here letting you know I don't sound as crisp as usual. That said, this episode is one of the most fun conversations we've had here on Writing for Roleplay, and I'm so excited to be sharing it with all of you. So without further ado, let's talk about role-playing games. Hello everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about something truly diabolical, something devastating, something evil. Today, we are talking about how to craft villains within your tabletop RPG campaign, from the mooks to the mini-bosses to the BBEG Big Bad Evil Guy themselves, or Big Bad Evil Girl, or Big Bad Evil Gender Nonconforming. All of that fits within the BBEG acronym framework. So, Kayla, any thoughts on villains before we get into the nitty-gritty?
I'm sorry, I've gotten lost in trying to think up of other words that begin with G.
Big Bad Evil Gary, when your Big Bad Evil guy is named Gary.
That's a name, not a word.
Big Bad Evil Goo, when you're in like a Nicktoons video game and the villain is a giant glob of goo.
Big Bad Evil Generator? Anyway.
So, as the saying goes, a hero without a villain is useless, but a villain without a hero is successful. A villain holds quite a bit of the narrative framework of a story. And especially in a game, your villain is often the personification of the conflict that your heroes are going through. And also usually the climactic encounter that ends a campaign or an adventure. After all, with a lot of RPGs, you're usually building up to that final fight, whether it's the fight against the big dragon, or it's the fight against the CEO of the corporation in your cyberpunk campaign, or it's the fight against this strange creature in your mystical steampunk mystery campaign. There's a lot of different ways you can make a villain, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. So I've kind of stumbled onto my first tip here, but this is going to be something that we're going to bring up again and again throughout these episodes. Tip number 1 for crafting your villain, once again, know your genre. You have to have an idea of what types of villains appear in the genre you're playing in. Once again, genres carry expectations. And, you can play these completely straight, you can flip them around, you can go against them, but you do have to know what tools you're working with before you can use the tools in creative ways. So in fantasy, you have your dragons, you have your evil warlords. In post-apocalyptic story, you have, once again, your evil warlords, or you have your mutants, or you have your robots or sentient AI. In cyberpunk, you have your CEOs of corporations, or you have your police chiefs, or you have your raiders. There's actually quite a bit of crossover between post-apocalyptic RPGs and cyberpunk dystopia. Or if you're playing a high school romance RPG, your villain might be the popular mean girl who likes to get messy with everyone's relationships. Or maybe it's the school principal that is almost like a footloose villain, like no sort of affection in my halls at any point. Either way, all of these villains represent obstacles. They represent a driving force of conflict for your players to rail against. And oftentimes, these villains will represent the themes of your campaign as well. Kayla, do you want to go a little bit more into that?
Well, yeah, we've talked about the link between genre and themes in the past. I think with villains, genres provide kind of parameters for what sort of villains you might expect, but really I think it's themes that you need to lean on the most. Villains kind of represent typically extreme positions on a particular theme or thesis that you're exploring. Just like a real quick sidebar, take it back to English class. Theme is not like brotherhood or peace and love or war is bad even necessarily. More of a thesis. A theme is like an argument. Stories are arguments and debates essentially on different viewpoints and perspectives on particular topics, whether it is, for example, in like Dungeon Meshi or Delicious in Dungeon. A huge theme of that manga is hunger, and thus also hunger by another name, desire. And so you have all of these different characters with really conflicting drives. And the lengths that they are willing to go to is so much the point of the story of like, how far are you willing to go? What are you willing to give up? Each character is an exploration or a different perspective on that. All of them have slightly different goals, and all of them have extremes that they are willing to or not willing to go to. And the way that they reflect upon each other, the way that they'll look at other people's goals and desires and say, what you want is bad. What I want and how badly I want it is okay. When you're looking at like your villains and the theme of your campaign, player characters, this is where I think it's really helpful to build your characters off of those villains and those themes, because they should be kind of a dark mirror to each other. And I'm not saying like, oh, you need to base your character entirely off of you need to ask your DM like, okay, so who's gonna be the villain, and then I need to make a character that's the opposite of that. No, not necessarily. You can make a hero that's really similar to your villain, which is what I did in our Curse of Strahd campaign. I was like, well, we're gonna go up against a vampire. I want to play a Dampier, and explore those themes of like hunger, temptation, wrath, etc. from the perspective of, but they have to be the hero of the campaign. So what divides them between, like, what makes them different from the villain? Why are they better than the villain? Are they better than the villain? Like, are they just the villain part 2?
Mm-hmm.
a new, in the Dark Knight, that one quote was like, either you die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
A strangely prescient quote.
That's a way that you can kind of take your hero creation if you want. This is the villain before all of their choices started to be too much, too extreme, too bad, etc. And sort of look at the path that diverges. Or you can go opposite. There's a lot of different ways that you can play that, but I think keeping in mind the villain of the campaign when you're building your player character can help you create a really fun hero to bounce off of that villain. And when you're thinking about the DMs, when you're thinking about your villains, think about, the heroes in your campaign and who's going to be, what's a fun like mini boss antagonist or whatever for the particular players in your party. What's a good like reflection for you to throw up and torture them with.
And that's something I'll do a lot in my campaigns as well. Like, usually when I start a campaign, I'll already have in mind, like, all right, here's the big beats, here's the big villain, here's sort of like the big themes of the campaign. But I really do love when an interesting player character comes to the table, especially if they have like a rival or another villain already preloaded into their backstory, because then I can take that character and put them into the campaign, and suddenly the story is a lot more personal.
You did that to me. I didn't even realize you were going to do that. When we played our first campaign together, Out of the Abyss, you were like, come up with a character, and it's like, I need a little bit of a backstory or whatever. So I made up this idea of like, oh yeah, they had a teacher that was like, it was like Anakin and Palpatine, basically. Realized what Palpatine was up to and ran away. I was just like, yeah, the evil wizard mentor or whatever, classic trope. I didn't know that the evil wizard was ever gonna come up, but guess what Kevin did? He threw up the evil wizard. It was like a beginning of Act 3, like end of Act 2, like mini boss for the party to fight, like as a way for us to get the magical item power-ups and such that we needed to go into the final arc there. So watch yourselves, players, because you could be handing the DM the weapons of your own near party TPK.
Well, going back to our episode on how to craft your player characters, I mentioned that with backstory, I'm really looking for 3 things. I'm looking for a motivation, I'm looking for a tie to the world, usually like a hometown or something like that, and I'm looking for a person. And sometimes that person doesn't need to be antagonistic. Sometimes that is the mentor figure that is still held in good regard. Or maybe it's a loved one that you became estranged with, or maybe it's like a child that this is why you're going adventuring, because you're trying to build up funds in order to ensure their future. But I love it when the person that's in a player character's backstory is either a rival or a villain, because that makes things dramatic and that makes things juicy. Oh boy, like you said, like you didn't know I was going to take the evil wizard from your backstory and put them into the Out of the Abyss campaign. But when he showed up, the mood at the table was like, you like tensed up and were like, oh no. And everyone else at the table was like, what? Who is this guy?
Yeah. They're like, who is this, looks at notes, Ra's al Ghul? Because that's what I named him as a freaking joke, because I didn't think he was ever gonna, I think I mentioned him like once or twice or whatever before he ever showed up. Because it was like, oh, what was your whole thing? I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like a magic school college dropout, you know, because my professor was a dick, et cetera, et cetera. You know, his name was Ra's al Ghul, and we're all like, ha ha ha, Batman joke. And then, yeah, it bit us in the ass a little bit.
We take Batman seriously on this podcast.
Oh, for sure. we take how unserious that we take Batman, and we take that very serious as well. On the whole, like, hero versus villain thing and the balance of it all, you know, villains are alluring because of the power they wield, and heroes are alluring because of the control that they have. I think villains are ultimately, in many ways, they're kind of out of control because they are an extreme, whereas heroes ultimately end up having to show some sort of restraint, usually, to avoid falling off of that deep end. It's hard to choose to be good. Good is a choice, and it is consistently a very hard choice. I think it's easier to choose evil. It's easier to be selfish. It's easier to not care. So yeah, you know, I think it's fun to hold up a mirror and see how one person could choose an easy way and another could choose like the harder way. And so that's, you know, one way to look at like a hero versus a villain, like foil, when you're looking at building your villains and your heroes in the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Another thing to look at when you're building your villains is, you know, the different types of villains that they are, especially in how they interact with the heroes. And for the purposes of this episode, I'm just going to list out some common types of villains that I've used quite a bit in my own RPG campaigns, especially in terms of like the different ways that the party has to navigate around them in order to deal with them. And these types can be used for both the BBEG as well as mini bosses. And some of them are, of course, going to be more inclined toward big bads rather than like, oh, this is the big named villain that we're fighting this session. So starting off, you, of course, have the mastermind. Once again, this is more inclined toward the big bad evil guy. They're the ones who are probably not strong themselves, but their main strength is their intelligence and how they play people, how they gather information, how they move along all of their plans with the force of someone in upper management, which, if wielded in the wrong hands, is an incredibly powerful and often boring force. The mastermind is also one of my favorite characters to play because just kind of in the situation that they are, they can afford to be incredibly overconfident and hammy. So whenever playing a mastermind villain, I always love to put on the deep evil voice and do the big monologues and the laughs and the all that good stuff.
A GM likes the mastermind best. Shocking. More news at 6.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the transition there is like the mastermind villain of someone trying to control everything, kind of going against a little bit of your dichotomy of someone who is out of control because they have too much control. The DM is someone who is also moving a bunch of pieces and changing up their plans as the heroes go through their world and constantly trying to figure out, all right, if this happens and this happens, but if this happens, then I'll make sure this happens. And if they go into this room, then I'll be sure to have like these villains in here. So, you know, there is a lot of similarities between the evil mastermind villain and the dungeon master as a narrative mechanical force. Now, on the flip side of that, there is the bruiser, who, while the mastermind is very complex and has a lot of irons in the fire, the bruiser is very straightforward and simple. They are big, they like to hit things, and they are a physical wall in front of your heroes. Now, the bruiser is usually not the big bad. I mean, unless they're sort of more of a conquering warlord who enforces their will through their strength alone kind of thing. But in my experience, the bruiser is often like a bodyguard of the main villain, usually sort of like the second in command, or they're the bouncer in front of the door keeping your characters from a location, or maybe they're a like chained up monster in an arena that the heroes have to fight before they can continue on.
There's a trope called the dragon, like that's the name of the trope, and it is essentially the villain who is maybe not the mastermind, the villain in charge, but it's the villain that the heroes fight the most, like come face to face the most. So Palpatine's the mastermind, but Vader is the bruiser. Ozai is like the mastermind, but Azula's the dragon, the bruiser, the one that, I mean, and that's not to say that Azula isn't like scheming or whatever, but the whole point of like the dragon villain trope, it doesn't have to be an actual dragon, but it's the one that the heroes are getting their asses handed to them by the most, and it's the one that they might actually be scared of more than they would be scared of the BBEG, you know, power on the throne villain, because this is the one that it becomes more personal with them. And I think that there's a lot of overlap kind of between the bruiser and the dragon trope.
But on the flip side, well, I take a shot every time I say on the flip side. On the flip side, the dragon could also be someone who is not straightforwardly simple in their violence. Perhaps the dragon is more of a Jafar tempter kind of character. And the tempter is the character who is constantly trying to make deals with the heroes, or perhaps they're trying to make deals with the big bad, the whispering poison in the ear. So, you know, you have your devils trying to make contracts, you have your queen bees in your romance setting who are trying to get entangled in all the messy relationships. You have your corpos in cyberpunk who are like, okay, you could make some money trying to heist us, or we could give you a job and give you some stable employment and healthcare. What do you say? That kind of thing. And so the tempter...
Ooh, healthcare.
Exactly. They know exactly what to tempt you with. And so the tempter, once again, perhaps they're not a very violent force. The angle you have to take the tempter is figuring out your convictions and whether or not it's worth it to work with them. And because of narrative tropes, most of the time, it is not worth it to work with the tempter. That's the whole point of the character. But sometimes there are situations where you have to work with the tempter, and then things get interesting. Those are usually less for like the big deals that the tempter wants you to make, and more of the like, hey, real quick, there's this guy I want dead. I'll give you some treasure if you figure out a way to kill them. Like that kind of thing. Basically, the tempter can become a quest giver at a certain point in the campaign if you want.
I think the tempter is also a good way to sow some intra-party conflict. If they are able to hook like one of the PCs and the others find out. I mean, you've done that in the past where you've had villains make deals with individual PCs in the party without the rest of the party being present or knowing, and then it comes out in conflict later. It's a fun little like subplot to have going. And you can have, like, just as a side note or whatever before we get to the end of this list, like, these can overlap. A villain could have shades of two or more of these categories, you know. We know that. This is just kind of a broad classification.
Yeah, I would say don't think of these types as like in concrete boxes with no overlap. These are more angles to think about villainy. Because a villain is not just someone who enacts violence on someone's face. Sometimes the villain is someone who works within established systems to their benefit. Perhaps the villain is someone who gets to the core of what the party of PCs wants and tries to tempt them. And sometimes the villain thinks they're the hero. And that's when we get to another type that is a favorite of mine I like to call the tragedy, aka cool motive, still murder. These villains usually leave the pomp and circumstance to the door. They're less and more, come on, guys, we need to do this kind of thing. And, you know, here's where you have your soldiers with good intentions. You have your fallen angels. You have your eco-terrorists. Like I said, anything that fits within the framework of cool motive, still murder falls under the tragedy. And so, you know, perhaps the way to defeat them is straightforward, you know, punching them in the face until they stop what they're doing. But at the same time, it does drive that conversation of the themes of your campaign. An effective tragic villain is someone who the party has to stop at least once and think, okay, are we doing this?
Yeah, the heroes should at one point probably be thinking, oh, this doesn't feel good. Like just something where it's, hesitates, where you really begin to see their point. And, again, intra-party conflict can come out here when the tragedy is so close to being like one of the party members. Betrayal also, it could be a good trope to use here. This could be a situation where you have an NPC that seems like an ally and then betrays the party or thinks that the party would agree with them. I mean, I think that's also the big thing too. When they think that they're the hero, the tragic villain would not necessarily see the heroes as antagonists to them. They might think that the heroes would be their allies and would agree with them because maybe they think, oh yeah, these guys are the heroes. I am also the hero, and we shall team up together. So that could be kind of one angle to take it. And then, yeah, there's the other angle of like, well, I'm correct. You guys are deeply misguided. The ends justify the means, and I will remove you in order to do this. It's not personal, but you guys are getting in the way.
And kind of going into that, this is just business, it's not personal, you guys are getting in the way. This could kind of be a subsect of the tragedy, but also I have played villains in this type that are definitely more of the, like, I am right and I don't care what other people think, the authority. So most villains are chaotic. In some way, they are trying to break apart the order for their own means, whether it's through greed, whether it's through power, whether they're just a wild animal who just wants to spread chaos wherever they are. But the authority is someone who occupies a great space of order. They are the person who is enforcing what is wrong with society. And that is why I love to use the authority, because then this villain becomes a personification of what your players hate in the real world, which I think is very fun to play out.
It's very fun, very cathartic.
Yeah, it's like you have a villain who's going back to Footloose. If you have a villain who's like, we are going to keep dancing illegal in order to enforce moral clarity, then everyone at your table is like, but I like dancing. Let's punch this guy. And then everyone has a fun time at the table.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot more topics that you can use in place of the authority, but that's the most innocuous right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as in particular D&D and similar systems, those type of adventuring parties do tend to be a little, rebellious at best, anarchist at, I don't want to say worst, but at most extreme.
There you go.
An anarchist party, depending on the context of the campaign, could, again, be, very heroic. But yeah, so having an authority, a boss figure of some kind who is laying out, a dictator. Like, I mean, having a dictator villain is fun to take down.
Side tangent, by the way, not sponsored, but I work with a company called Weaponized Inc., and they have a game out called The Hammer and the Stake, which is basically like, what if vampires took over a fascist government? And they have an anarchist expansion at the time of this recording coming out. It might be released by the time this episode released, I don't know, where you can play anarchists who are trying to take down the vampire government, which is very fun in my opinion.
Oh, that does sound fun. I mean, that's a little bit what Curse of Strahd is too.
That is
in some fashion.
Also, yeah. By the way, folks, if you want to listen to us talk more about Curse of Strahd, we do actually have a bonus episode out on our Ko-fi, where Kayla and I talk about Curse of Strahd, how much we love it, and also the large parts of the module that we would tweak and change if we were to run it again, or what I tweak and change whenever I run it, especially in terms of its depictions of marginalized races. If you want more of that, check out our Ko-fi, pledge a little bit of money, some of your pocket change, and then you can listen to it right now if you wanted. But back to the episode at hand. One of the things I like that RPGs do is when they do like what we just did, not plug a bonus episode behind a paywall, but list out types of villains that you can use for your games. And one big example I do have to bring up is Monster of the Week, which is a favorite game of mine, where it's exactly what it says on the tin. Like, the gameplay itself is there's a monster, and you and your heroes have to figure out what it is, what its weaknesses are, and then hunt it in order to keep it from killing innocents.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, if you enjoy shows like X-Files, Supernatural, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Grimm, Lockwood and Co. I think would kind of fall into that too. Actually, R.I.P. Only one season on Netflix.
Oof.
It's like that. There's it's based off of Monster of the Week TV shows, hence the title Monster of the Week.
It very much takes all those tropes and kind of puts them into a big bowl, and that's one of the reasons I like about the game. But another reason I like about the game is because they list out different types of monsters for you to put into your game in order to help you build the monster of the week. And some of these monster types are the Beast, the Collector, the Destroyer, the Devourer, the Executioner, the Parasite, the Queen, the Sorcerer, the Tempter. Oh, hey, look, something we brought up in a previous thing. The Torturer, the Trickster. And they really get into not only what are the powers of this monster and its appearance, but also what its motivations are. And that's a big thing to think about with these villains. Just when you're crafting your player characters, when crafting your villains, what makes them tick? Because at the end of the day, a villain is someone who has such an extreme drive that it puts them into conflict with everyone else around them, especially the heroes.
Yeah, I mean, if your villain doesn't really have a very good motivation, it is going to fall apart. And it doesn't, like, your villain doesn't have to have a necessarily, like, relatable motivation or even something that, it doesn't have to be justifiable necessarily to the characters or to the players around the table. It just needs to be justifiable to the villain.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be something compelling and understandable from their perspective. So it can be something that the PCs and the players are all like, well, that's ridiculous, or that's like the villain's motivation can be something that the players categorically do not agree with at all, but it needs to be believable for the villain. The villain does need to have a goal, a want, a drive, a motivation of some kind that they want to achieve, because if they're kind of just being evil for the lulz, I do think that in a long form, fairly serious campaign, it can kind of fall apart because it can become unbelievable to the party and sort of break immersion. It doesn't have to be like Killmonger or something in Black Panther where everybody's like, he's got points though. It can be...
He's got points though.
I mean, it can be as simple as, I want money. I mean, that's a pretty big, lots of real life villains, all they want is money. And, all many of us want is money, because in our current society, you need money to survive. Again, what makes a villain is the lengths that they're willing to go to and the people they're willing to crush in order to achieve those goals.
Now, there is a bit of difficulty whenever playing a villain in an RPG. And that is, especially in a combat-heavy RPG like Dungeons & Dragons, it's very hard for your heroes to meet the villain without them immediately trying to kill each other. On both sides. If the heroes see the villain, they might just all right, let's finish this up and try to kill them. And if the villain sees the heroes, there's very few reasons for the villain not to just take out an obstacle in their way. Because as we just said, a villain is often defined by the amount of people they're willing to crush in order to further their aims. Big way to get around this is that your players will know the villain's effect on the world before they know the villain. Like, before the villain steps in the room and goes, I am the villain, and this is why you should hate me. More than likely, your heroes are going to see the villages that they've burned out, or the people they've crushed, or their propaganda along the streets if they're in a position of power, or,
Remember that one bit in the Mulan movie where they're all singing about a girl worth fighting for, and then the music suddenly cuts off as they happen upon the village that is totally burned out and destroyed by the invading Huns? And it goes from, haha, so funny, here are all of my ideal dream girl characteristics or whatever to have a girl worth fighting for, and then it's just a burned out village, and they find, in the snow, the little doll that belonged to a little girl who is presumably murdered somewhere off camera where the children can't see in this Disney movie. And it's like, there it is. There was the girl worth fighting for, this innocent child. Yeah, you could do something like that to your heroes.
Another thing that's interesting about Mulan while we're on the subject is that after that point, it stops being a musical.
Yeah. it's a complete tonal shift. It's a neat film. I'm gonna rewatch it. Yeah, or like in Avatar, we don't meet Ozai until the third season. He's just in the background. He's so, you can have your main villain so far away that the heroes don't actually meet them until the final arc. One of the things I thought was interesting about, and here's where we could run into some trouble. One of the things I thought was really interesting about Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi was the whole Force Skype thing that Rey and Kylo Ren had going on that allowed them to interact and talk to each other without being able to hurt each other. I thought it was an interesting device. I thought it was really cool. It was a way to have the hero and villain have a conflict that couldn't be immediately resolved by just coming to blows. And, that's something that you could do in your own campaigns, is have some sort of magic vision thing happening. It happened in Shadow and Bone too. The Netflix show and the books, which predated Last Jedi. It's a thing to have some sort of prophetic vision or dream thing. And Percy would dream of Kronos and would have these visions and conversations with the villain. So you could set up some sort of device where your party meets the villain, but they can't actually physically harm each other, thus delaying like that physical combat.
Yeah, there are some other circumstances that you can put up in order to get your villains and your heroes talking without them immediately killing each other. One I like is when the villain sees the heroes more as like toys than actual obstacles. Like, once again, going back to Curse of Strahd. Strahd, in the raw text of the module, loves just showing up at random moments and smacking around the party and just kind of playing with them. But he doesn't want to kill. Yeah, he's bored. He doesn't want to kill them outright because it's like, hey, he wants them to become stronger so that way they're more fun. It's a very anime thing of him, honestly.
Yes, very much so. It's the one guy. I've seen the Netflix One Piece show. I haven't seen that much of the anime, but it's the Dracula looking dude who's always fighting Zoro. He's like, I'm gonna kill you next time, and then he never kills him because he's like, this is fun. Like, go get stronger and then come back and maybe I'll kill you next time. Or, I mean, it's Joker and Batman. Like, Joker doesn't really want to kill Batman. He doesn't know what he would do if Batman was dead. So yeah, you can have a villain who's like, I like your spunk, I'm gonna keep you around, and basically just incapacitates the heroes, which can really put the fear of God into the party, because the party can then become hyper aware of the fact that the only thing keeping them alive when they go up against this villain is the villain's whims. Like, they can't stand against the villain, truly. If the villain wanted to kill him this time, they could do it. Or maybe the villain will just kill a couple of them and leave half the party alive. Like, they don't know.
And another circumstance that you can get your villains and heroes talking to each other without coming to blows is if they're held by, like, the law.
Societal conventions?
Yeah, just standard social and legal conventions. Were it not for the laws
of this land, I would have murdered you.
Exactly.
Where you stand?
How many scenes are there of Superman coming up to Lex Luthor's office and Superman being like, look, I could punch my fist through your chest and take out your heart on the other side, but then I would get arrested.
Also, well, that's not why Superman does. He has other morals.
There's a lot of reasons, but Lex Luthor is banking on, like, Superman isn't going to just kill me because we aren't in the circumstance where we can come to blows. Like, I haven't hit first. So all he can do is come to my office and give me the stink eye.
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely, like, you can, if your villain is in a particular position within the society, the heroes don't have proof of their wrongdoing, and we talked earlier about how parties tend to be a little anarchist. Just because they're murder hobos doesn't mean they're above the law of the land. Like, feel free to have your characters who break the law potentially face consequences. Because I do think that certain types of video games and stuff have kind of put it into our mind that if you're a PC in, say, D&D or something similar, you can kind of do whatever you want without consequence because you're stronger than everybody, which, I mean, that's kind of a villainy line of thinking, Don't be afraid to sort of put, boundaries around, like, hey, compulsory magic is illegal. If you get caught, like, charming people, you could face consequences for that, you know, and who are the type of people that are enforcing rule of law on really strong adventurers? Probably other really strong adventurers, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Necromancy tends to be flavored as like taboo. Is it illegal? Are characters going to face consequences in certain areas for necromancy? Are some villages more open to magic, more Wild Westy, more Pirate Island than other villages? You know, these are things that you could play with of what is legal and illegal within your world, and where are your heroes going to be able to get away with some of the bullshit they like to pull, and where are they not going to be able to get away with it, and who's going to hold that line and stop them.
And then you do reach a certain point in the adventure or the campaign where you're past the social meetings, you're past seeing the effects of the villain, you're past the villain's minions and his lieutenants, and you've gotten to the villain themselves, and you're ready for the actual fight with the villain, the final encounter, the climax of the campaign. My one big piece of advice I would give in this moment is to give your villain a unique game mechanic. Because at the end of the day, we're not just writing a story here when we're playing a tabletop RPG. We are also designing games. And one of the big things of game design is that if you have a unique character, give them a unique ability.
Yeah, I mean, dragons have like their lair actions, and there's all sorts of legendary actions and all sorts of other bullshit that the DM pulls out of his ass when everybody's got 10 HP and no spell slots left, and you're dying, and you're like, what do you mean they can do that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you over the sound of the dragon's fire breath. But that is a big, like, that's why dragons are memorable, is because they're so different than a lot of the enemies that you fight in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Like, they can fly, they can breathe elements, they can shape the environment around them. You have to think about fighting them in different ways because they are different. And it's not just dragons in Dungeons and Dragons that have unique mechanics. I also love playing mind flayers, who attack the party in ways that they're not used to, with like psychic blasts and mind control. And it's like, yeah, the barbarian's been taking a lot of physical damage and, you know, jumping over the pits filled with traps and spikes. But as soon as they get hit with a psychic blast, suddenly they're just out of the fight. And I love that.
Yeah, mind flayers are a real bitch to fight, especially if, I mean, God, I don't know how you would do it without, like, a wizard in the party. Jeez. I mean, you gotta have at least one party member with good intelligence in a mind flayer fight. Otherwise, you really are relying on dice rolls. It can get really damn dicey, no pun intended, taking on a mind flayer when almost every class is like, yeah, you could just dump intelligence. You don't need that.
But when you build up to this final encounter with the villain, it feels really great when they have unique abilities that the characters have to approach in a different way.
Yeah, it's exciting.
And another thing to think about for the final encounter is, where is the final encounter? It is phenomenal when you're in a boss arena that has been designed for the battle of mind. And sometimes that's just like a big pillared church, and the effect of the location is just the aesthetics. I'm looking at you, every Dark Souls boss. But sometimes it's really fun to like throw around some unique terrain, like moving platforms, or pits of lava, or pits of acid, or pits of toxic goo. I love having pits and then filling them with weird stuff. I love a good pit.
Yeah, anything that's gonna complicate it, basically, for the party and give them one more thing to think about. And I mean, on the DM side, you know, it's one more thing for you to think about, too. But, yeah, anything that's just gonna spice it up. And, I mean, obviously, you know, you're probably thinking about things that make it harder on the party and easier for the villain. But sometimes there are things, I mean, it could be an arena that is difficult for the villain too, or a way that the players could potentially, you know, pull an Uno reverse and make this area a challenge for the villain and trap them between one of these pits or something, you know.
And it can also change up the social circumstances of the fight as well. Like, you know, thinking about Monster of the Week, there's a difference between fighting Bigfoot in his cave lair and attempting to fight Bigfoot in a crowded festival where you're also trying to keep Bigfoot like away from people, and then suddenly it's
Yeah.
like, oh, I can't just cast fireball, I now have to be more subtle about taking down this creature so no one else knows that I can use magic, and then I have a whole new problem.
Yeah, yeah. Don't be afraid to throw in collateral damage opportunities there, which your heroes may or may not ignore. You know, there's a joke about the wizard saying, I didn't ask how big the area was, I said I cast fireball. And I mean, that could be a fun thing to throw in there in these big boss fights. If, you know, there's a lot of criticism of superhero movies is the superheroes are causing almost as much damage as the villains, it seems, you know? Again, don't be afraid to sort of play with this and look at these unique aspects that we don't always see explored in, you know, mainstream media. You know, if that's one of your criticisms of superhero movies, congratulations, you are now writing your own superhero movie. Have at it.
So let's get into our last tip here, especially if you're playing in a home game, and this will probably be a little bit different if you're doing like an actual play where you're promoting this to a wider audience. But my big tip for creating villains is steal.
Yeah.
Check out your favorite villains in all the media that you like and take what you like about them and then put them into the villains in your game. Kayla, you have a lot of thoughts on villains. I would love to hear what are some of your favorite villains.
I do love villain. I just think they're, again, the extremes that they are willing to go to in a fictional setting can just be so cathartic and interesting. But yes, I did see Revenge of the Sith when I was 10 years old. It was the first Star Wars movie I saw on a big screen. Not the first Star Wars movie I saw, just the first I saw on a big screen.
Okay.
And I loved Anakin so much. I was prequels before I was the OG. That's how I was introduced to it, because again,
Sacrilege.
like that's how my dad, who is an OG Star Wars fan, he did that because of the timing of when Revenge of the Sith was out, and he wanted to take me. He's like, you're old enough now to see this, so let's catch you up. Here's 1 and 2. We don't have time to do the reverse order thing, because we're gonna go in episode order. So we got one. We rented 1 and 2 from Blockbuster, and I watched them, and I didn't think anything was wrong with Jar Jar Binks because I was 10. And then I saw Revenge of the Sith, and I was like, yeah. I mean, you'd think probably most children would watch Revenge of the Sith, and I mean, be upset. I loved the tragedy of it all and the drama of it all, and I loved Anakin. I think he's a great villain.
That explains so much.
I love him, and I love that he was a whiny little bitch. But also, the dude has had this massive evil psychic pressure bearing down on him. He was a slave. He was born into slavery and then taken from his mother, who the next time he saw her 10 years later, she was tortured and murdered as he was helpless with all of this, like, awesome power. Listen, Anakin did a lot of things wrong, but I just find him to be a fascinating, compelling, and really interesting character. I also Magneto's great. Ghostface from Scream's really cool because anybody can be behind the mask, so it allows you to really play with what Ghostface is.
Ghostface is more of an idea than a character.
Yes, exactly. I do find that to be very fun. These like legacy type characters. Azula, as we've mentioned previous in the episode, she's great. An excellent tragic character. Jinx and Silco in Arcane, I thought they were really cool. Also tragic characters. Father from Full Metal Alchemist, the manga, and also Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Super cool villain. Luke Castellan from Percy Jackson, Barbossa, and then Lord Beckett from Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, pretty much any of the Batman villains. Also, like, Slade from Teen Titans.
Oh, yeah.
Deathstroke is, like, neat, but Slade from Teen Titans Cartoon Network show. That's the cool, like, to me, that's better than Deathstroke in the comics. But yeah, I mean, also, interestingly, notably, a lot of the, like, adult sci-fi fantasy I've been reading lately, the books and stuff, there hasn't been a ton of traditional big bad evil guy, like, one character lording over everybody, causing all of these problems. A lot of them have been, like, systems or smaller antagonists representing basically larger failures within societies and systems. That is kind of interesting when you have sort of not a mastermind, not a BBEG character, but smaller cogs in the machine, essentially, who are complicit. Those are fun villains to take on. I guess if I have to pick like a D&D one, Strahd's great.
I am also a big fan of Strahd.
I hate that man and I love that man.
Well, one of the reasons I love Strahd is exactly what I said earlier in the episode, is that Strahd sees the heroes as playthings, and it is encouraged by the module for Strahd to show up a bunch and like smack around the party. He has a lot of different powers that you can play with, and he is a very powerful character. So me as a GM, it's like me taking out my favorite toy and kind of putting him on the board and being like, ho, time to have some fun for an hour. Let's do this.
He also, he feels very human.
Mm-hmm.
He was, by virtue of being a vampire, he was once human. And I think a lot of, again, D&D and similar systems, they have villains that are like gods or devils or dragons, and these like huge evil by nature almost characters. Whereas Strahd very much is like, Strahd wasn't born evil. Strahd became evil. It's not like it's Tiamat, where you're fighting this primordial force of nature, this being of chaos and death, where it's an existential threat. Strahd does feel like you are fighting a person with pretty, like, understandable, sometimes sympathetic motivations, but also he's a nasty little bitch, too. So his villainy feels also very, like, real-worldy, I think, is the other thing, too. Like, we don't have Tiamat in the real world. We don't have the Demogorgon in the real world. But we do have Strahds in the real world. So fighting Strahd in the game, it does feel a little... more real, it feels more immersive, it feels more personal, which I think kind of helps make it all the more compelling.
Well, I love geeking out about Strahd, but we do save all the rest of our geeking out about Strahd in our bonus episode, which, once again, if you head to our Ko-fi page, links in the show notes, you can throw us some pocket change, and you can listen to our bonus episode of Kayla and I just geeking out about Curse of Strahd and talking about all the things that interest us about it. Kayla, can you lead us out here?
Yeah, thanks for that incredible segue, Kevin. So what are some of your most memorable villains? Either favorite villains from books, TV shows, movies, etc., or villains from your own campaigns? Let us know. Tell us about why they suck or why they're the best. We want to know. We love villains. If you liked this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share with a friend. Follow us on social media. We got the links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content stuff like extra episodes, access to the private Discord, etc. Check it out. Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff, like read the outro this time. We post a new episode every Tuesday. See you next week.
See you next week.